In this demonstration, we're going to talk about how to optimize disks on a Linux system. On Linux, there's no such thing as a defragmentation utility. The way the Linux file systems work, you don't need it, but you do on Windows. So let's take a look at a couple of utilities you do use on Linux. Now, these utilities are run from the shell prompt within the command line environment, so I need to open up a terminal session. Let's make this a little bit bigger so we can see what we're working with. Now, the commands I need to be run need super user access to the system. And I'm currently logged in as my rtracy user, and rtracy is just a standard user. Therefore, before I can run these commands, I need to switch to my root user account. Root is the super user on a Linux system, and I do this using the su space dash command, and then I enter the root user's password. The first command I want to show you is the df command. The df command will tell you how much disk space is being consumed on each of the file systems on your Linux system. Now, if you just run df without any options, the output will be formatted in terms of consumed blocks, which is fine, but you have to do a lot of math to figure out how many megabytes and gigabytes that actually translates to. Therefore, a good option to use with the df command is the -h option, which formats the output in human readable form. That's what H stands for. If I press enter, I can now see how much space is being used on each of the file systems on this system. Over here on the left, we can see each individual file system. We can see how big those file systems are. We can see how much space has already been consumed on those file systems, how much space is still available, and then we can see usage statistics in terms of % of available space. And over here, we can see where that file system is mounted in the directory tree structure. For example, over here, we have a file system called /dev/sdb1. Now, understand on Linux, each of your disks and partitions are identified using a device file. These device files are stored in the /dev directory, and each disk and each partition has its own device file. And you can tell which disk or partition we're talking about by looking at the name. First of all your storage devices file names will begin with SD, stands for storage device. Where you want to start looking is the third character right here. In this case, we have a B. B indicates that this is the second hard disk drive in the system. Notice up here we have /dev/SDA. This indicates that this is the first hard disk drive in the system, while this is the second. And then the last character identifies which partition on that storage device we're talking about. In this case, I have the second storage device in the system, and it is the first partition on that device. In fact, it's the only partition on that device. Over here, we can see how big that device is, how big that partition is. It's 16 gigabytes, of which 181 megabytes are currently used. So there's still 15 gigs free on this file system. 2% of the available space has been consumed, and that partition is actually mounted in the /mnt/shared directory in the file system. In fact, if we come over here to activities and click on our file browser and go to computer, and then go to the /mnt directory, and then to the shared directory, we can actually see the files that are stored on this partition, because this partition is mounted in this directory. So the df command provides us with a nice overview of how disk space is being consumed on the system. Now, there's another command that you need to be familiar with called the du command. Du works a little differently. Du will run through all the directories within a particular directory structure and tell you how much space is being consumed by the files in that directory. This command is especially useful when working with the /home directory, because /home is where all of our users have their home directories, and that's where they save all their files. So hence, if you're going to run out of space on a Linux system, it'll probably be within /home. So you can see I have two user accounts on the system. I have K. Sanders and I have rtracy. If I want to see how much disk space each of these users is using, I can type du space -h. Again, the -h parameter specifies that du reformat the output in human readable format. Press enter, and it runs through each of the directories in the K. Sanders home directory and the rtracy home directory. Now, if we want to just get a high-level summary of how much space each user is consuming, we can just look at the root directory of each user's home directory. In this case, it's the K. Sanders directory for the K. Sanders user. She's only using about 3.9 megabytes, so she's not using much space at all on the system. We scroll up in the output and find the root directory for my rtracy user. You see that I'm using about 31 megabytes of disk space in my home directories, which isn't very much, so we're good. Neither of these users is overutilizing the storage space available on the disk. But if they were, you could then scroll through all of these different subdirectories of the home directory and see which directories are consuming the most space. You can look over here in this column to see how much space is being used in each of those directories. And then if you found one that was being overutilized, they've downloaded hundreds of gigs of data, then you might want to talk to them and say, hey, could you clean up some of those files that you don't actually need because you're using too much space? Now, the last command we want to look at in this demo is the file system check command, FSCK. Now, FSCK is used to look for errors in the file system. Before we can run FSCK, though, however, we have to specify which file system it is that we want to check for errors. Let's go back to our df command. And notice right here we have the /dev/sdb1 file system that is mounted in /mount/shared. Let's check the file system on this partition for errors. Now, before we can do this, we have to unmount this partition from the directory where it's mounted in the file system. So to do that, I'm going to have to close this window over here, otherwise it'll report that file system as being in use and it won't let me unmount it. You type umount and then enter the device file name for the partition that you want to unmount. Now, a lot of folks who are new to Linux say, hey, wait a minute, you made a mistake. You typed umount, not unmount. And I said, yep, that's exactly right, because the command is not unmount, it is umount. So we type umount /dev/sdb1, hit enter. And now this partition is no longer mounted in this directory in the file system. And because it's not mounted anymore, we can check it for errors. To do this, we type FSCK, followed by the device file name for that partition, /dev/sdb1, the partition whose file system we want to check. Press enter. It'll run through, check the file system for errors, and warn us if there's any problems. It'll actually try to clean up and fix any errors that it can. If it runs into errors that it can't, it'll provide a warning. However, you can see that this file system was actually clean, so we are good to go. Now, in order to start using the files in that file system again, I have to remount this partition back into the directory structure in /mount/shared. So I would type mount -t followed by the file system type that's been created on this partition. And I happen to know that I used the ext4 file system when I created the file system on that partition. Then I have to specify the device file name of the partition that I want to mount, /dev/sdb1. And then I have to specify where I want to mount that partition in the file system so I can access the files on that partition, /mnt/shared. And now if we go back over here and open up files again, go to computer, go to mount, shared. I should be able to see all my files. Everything's back the way it was. And we know that the file system on this partition is free of errors. That's it for this demonstration. In this demo, we talked about optimizing disks on a Linux system. We first looked at the df command, the du command, and then we ended this demonstration by looking at the file system check command.